Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. CS.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is my privilege to appear at the plenary of the National Assembly this afternoon in compliance with the letter from the clerk that was dated 28th of November 2023. The aforementioned invitation required me to respond to the question of private notice number 19 of 2023 and also extended leave to provide policy positions as appropriate. In the section immediately below, I have therefore responded to the question.
Minister, I want us to deal with this question because of the heavy calendar I have in the next 45 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
That will include a myriad of supplementaries.
Thank you.
And joyriding.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to respond as follows. In part 1, maintenance of public roads is funded by the Road Maintenance Levy Fund, commonly known as fuel levy. The allocation of funds collected from the fuel levy is implemented in accordance with the legislation enacted by this august House. In particular, the Kenya Roads Act 1999, Section 6(2), D and E stipulates percentage allocation out of the funds as follows. 22% is allocated equally to all constituencies in the country to be administered by the Rural Roads Authority. 10% of the allocated funds is allocated for the maintenance or development of link roads between constituencies and serve as a government counterpart funds in funding work on rural roads to be administered by the Kenya Rural Roads Authority, and that the said percentum shall be equally distributed to the constituencies where Kenya Rural Authority has a mandate. 40% of the allocated funds is allocated in respect of national roads to be administered by National Roads Highway Authority. 15% of the allocated funds is allocated in respect of the urban roads to be administered by Urban Roads Authority. 1% of the allocated funds is allocated in respect of roads in national parks and reserves to be administered by the Kenya Wildlife Service. A maximum of 2% of the allocated fund is allocated in respect of the recurring expenditure of the board, and administration of the balance of 10% is in accordance with the road sector investment program approved by the Ministry of Roads. With reference to KERA, which was the subject of the question, members will note that the allocation of 32% of fuel levy, which is earmarked for rural roads, is distributed, and Mr. Speaker, with emphasis, is distributed equally to the concerned constituencies. The 10% of the fuel levy funds mentioned under Section 6 of the Kenya Roads Act is allocated to address, among others, emergencies and security roads. The Constituency Roads Committee, which have appointees of the national government CDF and the patronage of the honorable members, are valuable instruments in ensuring equity and optimal use of fuel levy at the constituency level. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, it is clear that the roads maintenance levy is distributed equally. It therefore means that every honorable member here is superintending and oversighting in this financial year, Mr. Speaker, an amount herein provided which is of the 22% in each and every of the 290 constituencies. We have 44,522,070. In the 10%, Mr. Speaker, you have 20,237,305. As a matter of fact, and for the record of this House, this financial year, every constituency in the Republic of Kenya, without any discrimination, receives 64 million shillings, 759,375. Mr. Speaker, let me now turn to development vote. Turning to the development vote, Mr. Speaker, budgetary allocation to various projects are processed through the annual budgetary cycle culminating in appropriation by the National Assembly. This budget preparation cycle includes detailed scrutiny by the Appropriation Committee of the National Assembly. It is notable that appropriations under the development vote are project specific, and once approved by Parliament, the ministry stands guided and instructed to implement the same. The initial budget allocation proposal for the development vote are generated by agencies of the ministry, taking into account the following parameters. Top priority is given to completion of ongoing projects, which is also a requirement under the Public Finance Management Act. Availability of fiscal space for new projects, government policies and strategic directions concerning infrastructure development taken together with technical and economic feasibility, equity and regional balance. Mr. Speaker, therefore, there is another category, and I wish honorable members can help me appreciate this point, Mr. Speaker, because it's the cause of so many of the questions that either come to my office privately or as generated by members of parliament in this chamber or are as addressed by members of parliament in public square. There is another category of projects which come about as a result of constitutional imperatives and public participation as guided by Parliament. Mr. Speaker, projects arising from public participation process are implemented by KERA largely without modification to the priorities selected and approved by Parliament. Through this distinguished House, I hope to make it clear to the public that such projects are entirely consistent with fairness and due process and should not be ascribed to any deficit of equitable allocation of projects by KERA. Mr. Speaker, turning to the tender notice published by Kenya Rural Roads Authority. And Mr. Speaker, I will be coming back to this issue of public participation funds that are appropriated every year by Parliament, including how much was appropriated this financial year and how this has become a matter of immense contention, despite the fact that it's the honorable members of this chamber who approve these resources. Mr. Speaker, turning to the tender published by the Kenya Rural Roads Authority on 29 September 2023, serious misunderstanding and misinterpretation of the notice appeared in various fora. I am grateful to for this opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to set the record straight for this distinguished House. Allow me to mention 5 key points, Mr. Speaker, at which the public were misled when the tender notice by KERA was taken in isolation as evidence of iniquity. First, Mr. Speaker, the tender contained projects that are based on termination and retendering. KERA, in implementing various development vote projects, has encountered a number of non-performing contractors. After repeated efforts to revive the affected projects failed, it was found necessary to terminate the projects. Permission has been obtained from the Attorney General to wind up the projects and conduct fresh tendering to enable continuation of the projects. For avoidance of doubt, there are other similar terminated projects for which replacement contractors will be sought through open tenders even in the future. Number 2, Mr. Speaker, is the inclusion of public participation projects. Public participation projects are identified, Mr. Speaker, and approved by Parliament before being handed over to KERA for implementation, at which point the tenders are advertised. Extraction of public participation projects from the procurement notice without background and origin being made clear, and use of the same comparisons, which projects funded by other sources, leads to invalid conclusions. The projects are distributed across the country in line with the principle of public participation and other constitutional imperatives considered and determined by this House. The question, therefore, as to whether it is just, fair, or equitable is not better answered by the Cabinet Secretary. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, it is better answered by this House. And Honorable Mbui, being a distinguished leader in this House for 2 terms, has a better answer than Cabinet Secretary or any other person, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in fact, Mr. Speaker, since the budget is itemized to specific roads, Mr. Speaker, the ministry or its agencies cannot for sure establish where the roads are located. Mr. Speaker, for the last 5 years, the fund distributed by this House through these mechanisms is in the knowledge of this House. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, I would like to say for this financial year, this very chamber, this very House, Mr. Speaker, budgeted a sum total of 21 billion shillings, which is far higher than the money allocated to KERA under road maintenance levy through the RMLF. So if the distribution of these resources, Mr. Speaker, to various agencies as budgeted is unfair, then neither KERA nor the ministry will be blamed, because we are constitutionally bound to implement the decisions of this House without injecting a scintilla of doubt, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the third indicator of the projects that were advertised is where we have cases of emergency, like the situation with El Nino. The ministry allocated resources either from the emergency fund or other sources to address these emergencies. The emergencies arise as works are tendered by any road agency for purpose of repair. Those activities are specific to network reinstatement, to the geographical location in question, and generalized comparisons with other counties, for example, are not valid. Such projects also include security roads aimed at improving security operations. Where we have cases of emergency, like in the case of El Nino, the ministry will allocate resources either from the contingency fund or from other sources, including those budgeted by this House. Such allocation shall not be misconstrued to mean unfair allocation of resources, because they will be addressing, Mr. Speaker, what in law is called force majeure, or otherwise known as the act of God. Fourth, Mr. Speaker, is the aggregated funding towards constituency roads identified by Constituent Roads Committee. Mr. Speaker, a number, and this is important also for emphasis, Mr. Speaker, a number of the Constituency Roads Committee have gained experience, have found that it is best to combine various approved budgetary allocation into one bigger project, which is tendered as one package. Mr. Speaker, the consequence of this approach was that the size of the project tends to exceed the regional threshold of 10 million, which necessitates KERA to conduct the procurement at a national level. It can be seen that if these aggregated initiatives are extracted in isolation from their procurement notice and used in general comparison with CRCs, which have not adopted the same approach, errors would result, Mr. Speaker. The notorious constituencies for which type of costs are those that are in urban and peri-urban areas, such as Kikuyu constituency, where the majority leader, Mr. Speaker, comes from. When the adverts appear nationally, people tend to question why are these areas having been considered with big projects, when in reality they have aggregated their resources to one project, Mr. Speaker, and like many other constituencies, especially in rural areas, which receive equal amounts to the same constituencies, but choose to allocate them to projects of less than 10 million shillings, and therefore advertised at the regional level. So, Mr. Speaker, some of the members of parliament here guiding their constituency roads committee decide that instead of funding roads of less than 10 million shillings, they aggregate their money to 20, to 30, to 40, and decide that it be advertised at the national level by KERA because of the constitutional and legal imperatives for advertisement. As a result, you will find, for example, Kikuyu constituency, in the advert that was shared by Honorable Mbui, they are there advertising a project, but the other constituencies across the country where they advertise their roads below 10 million cannot appear in the advert because they will appear in the regional advert where these advertisements occur. And again, Mr. Speaker, taking it in isolation would appear as though one constituency is getting more than the other, yet it is just about how those resources are being utilized by the constituency. Mr. Speaker, it is, Mr. Speaker, Fifth is misinterpretation of project cost as an annual budget. And this is where, again, the question of Honorable Mbui, Mr. Speaker, is extremely important. Part of the misinformation associated with KERA notice number of 29th September 2023, Mr. Speaker, is insinuation that the multi-year global cost estimate for various projects was in fact a budget allocation for a single year, and thus an indication of a skewed allocation of scarce resources. While this incorrect interpretation is easily detected and corrected through cross-reference to approved budgets by this House and approved annual road work plans, I take this opportunity to once again assure the House that the allegations of skewed resource allocation was utterly without basis. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I have been baffled by the utterances by both inside and outside these chambers by elected representatives of the people who have been given enormous mandate and responsibility to do this sacred duty of distributing the public resources, Mr. Speaker, to turn around the whole world, either feign ignorance, Mr. Speaker, on the public,
Order.
or Mr. Speaker,
Order, honorable members.
or Mr. Speaker.
Yes, Robert Mbui, what is out of order?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker,
He's answering your question, remember?
Mr. Speaker, I do agree, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, you know that this is a question that I raised in the House Business Committee that you chair. And we agreed as a House that instead of talking about it, even in this chamber, Mr. Speaker, because I had wanted to seek for your permission to do an adjournment motion, we agreed that we ask the CS so that he can come and clarify. Mr. Speaker, is the CS in order to lecture members of Parliament? And I want to say what he has said, that he is baffled by utterances, both inside and outside these chambers, Mr. Speaker, by elected representatives of the people who have been given a mandate to turn around the whole world and either feign ignorance or deliberately mislead the public. Mr. Speaker, is the CS allowed to say such words in this House? Mr. Speaker, the CS has to withdraw that statement and apologize to this House.
He is answering your question. Let him finish. You will interrogate him.
Mr. Speaker.
Minister, order. Order, honorable members. I have brought the minister for you to grill him on whatever you want. That grilling and questioning excludes shouting at the minister. So listen to him. When he finishes, everybody will have an opportunity to ask questions which I shall compel him to answer. But let's have some decorum in the House. Minister, try and paraphrase your answers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Yes.
The reason why, Mr. Speaker, I have to go this length to answer in detail is, Mr. Speaker, there is a misconstrued position in the public that certain constituencies or certain counties or certain communities are getting projects more than the others. Mr. Speaker, I have overemphasized that should there be unfair distribution of these resources, Mr. Speaker, the problem squarely lies in the House that allocates the resources. Mr. Speaker, I will be willing, Mr. Speaker, I will be willing to be educated where else budget takes place in the Republic of Kenya. The only supreme august house in the Republic of Kenya which allocates resources and not, Mr. Speaker.
Order, Minister, take your seat. Honorable members, let's take the answer. Minister, try and paraphrase. Yes. You have made your policy statement. Avoid the temptation to appear as if you are lecturing members. Order, I need no assistance. I need no assistance from any one of you. Avoid the temptation to appear as if you are lecturing members. Answer the question. Indeed, many of these members keep coming to my chamber to raise the same questions. That's why you've been called here. When he finishes, I'll give you time to ask questions. I had allocated 45 minutes. I'll even allocate more time for you to ask questions and be satisfied with what the minister is doing in your constituencies and elsewhere in the country.
For the assurance of the House, Mr. Speaker, I will be tabling itemized budget by this House past this financial year, clear with indication of the money for every road and for every county and for every constituency. So that, Mr. Speaker, it becomes clear that there is no other entity in this country or in the world that budgets for roads for our country except this honorable august House. Mr. Speaker, it is unfortunate, therefore, that these projects were misconstrued as an introduction of new projects. For avoidance of doubt, Mr. Speaker, the replacements of non-performing contractors, I'm just giving a summary of what you say, as you said, Mr. Speaker, that for the avoidance of doubt, the replacement of these non-performing contractors, some of whom have abandoned the site, is continuous, and after termination, the replacement of these contractors will be done through an open tender as provided in an annex that I have here, which is part of the advertisement just after the one Honorable Mbui spoke about. Mr. Speaker, the annex we are provided indicates that the number of projects that were retendered by KERA, anyone looking at the advert also in isolation, Mr. Speaker, would be forgiven to think that it's new projects or it is giving advantage to certain counties as against the other. Mr. Speaker, some of these re-advertised projects were initially tendered in the years 2015, 2016, 2017, and the contractors were unable to deliver to date. It was only in the interest of justice in these counties that the KERA re-advertises them as approved by the Attorney General. Some of the counties in the annexure, Mr. Speaker, include Homa Bay, Kisii, Nandi, Baringo, Kakamega, and Makwiny. Mr. Speaker, as indicated earlier, each year Parliament, in its wisdom, allocates resources to various projects across the country, which are later advertised by three road agencies, including KERA. A large portion of these projects is actually implemented by KERA. Therefore, the extraction of the public participation projects without the benefit of background can be easily mislead the public to think some of these projects are being funded afresh, when in reality, Parliament in its wisdom is using the budget process to add resources to address inequality. So as I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, there is no better institution that can understand the origin of these projects than the National Assembly itself. And there are no greater public officers to explain the wisdom behind the allocation than the members of this august House. In summary, therefore, Mr. Speaker, the notice published on 29 September 2023 by KERA was not a budget or an instrument of allocating resources. Instead of KERA waiting until other approved projects across the country were ready to commence procurement, thus delaying those which are ready, KERA moved this batch towards procurement in the expectation that subsequent budgets will follow. As a matter of fact, the notice was followed by subsequent notices and others will still follow. I believe that by moving with speed on procurement matters at all times, KERA is fulfilling its mandate and meeting the expectation of this House. The final part of the response, Mr. Speaker, is in relation to the question about the factors influencing allocation of funds to projects. It is seen in this response to part 1 above that the initial budget allocation proposal for development vote are generated by agencies of the ministry, taking into account the following, which I repeat for purpose of clarity: completion of the ongoing projects, availability of fiscal space for new projects, government policies and strategic directions concerning infrastructure development taken together with technical and economic feasibility, equity, and regional balance. The initial budget proposal are then subjected to extensive review before eventually being enacted by Parliament on one project per line basis. I submit for consideration of this august House that there are no unexplained discrepancies in allocation of projects funds, that no counties have been omitted. Concerning the published KERA notice of 29 September 2023, where a batch of ready tenders was submitted for procurement, it is seen that subsequent publication of more budgets of ready tenders will address the remainder of the projects which are captured in the budget approved by Parliament. Indeed, there would have been a risk that the publication of future budgets of tenders in which those tenders were not on 29 September 2023 are of course not mentioned could have generated another wave of concern of iniquity in the reverse direction were it not for you, Mr. Speaker, and this House granting me the opportunity to explain this issue during this session. Mr. Speaker, the Minister has taken measures to ensure equitable and fair allocation of funds for the improvement of roads and drainage structures.
You have 10 minutes, Minister.
Improvement structures in light of the prevailing weather circumstances. These measures include the Ministry's playing an active role as part and parcel of the National Disaster Response Team being Coordinator Minister of Interior to ensure that we respond to the El Nino situation. Number two, under the Equalization Fund, Mr. Speaker, this House approves a budget that deals with marginalized areas, and the Ministry, through its agencies, implements the same. Minister also, Mr. Speaker, by ensuring prompt, simultaneous, and adequate disbursement of RMLF funds to all constituents to enable the timely tendering and commencement of works. Ministry, through Kenya Roads Board, continues to review applications from county governments on roads that are matured enough to be moved to national level, Mr. Speaker, for reconsideration depending on the resources that are available. Fourth, equal allocation RMLF to carer under 22 and 10% are usually advertised in two ways, which I have explained. If it is less than 10%, 10 million, Mr. Speaker, in the region, and if it's above that, it is advertised at the national level. Fifth, as a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, the notice that was in public domain contains only engineers' estimates, and it is not, Mr. Speaker, the actual cost, which will be determined after advertisement and when the tender is awarded, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, utilizing the remaining 7 minutes, let me say this. Mr. Speaker, we are in danger when it comes to the road maintenance levy. And this is where this discussion is coming from. Mr. Speaker, the primary source of this road maintenance levy is levy applied designated to petroleum, which is 18 shillings per litre. A challenge has emerged in recent years in terms of revenue collected under fuel levy. In 2021-2022, it was 87 billion, Mr. Speaker. In 2022-2023, it was 86. In this financial year, Mr. Speaker, it's still 86 billion. In short, the collection of fuel levy has stopped increasing, and in the worst case scenario, may reduce going forward. This situation will not improve if electric mobility picks up quickly as anticipated. While the rate of the fuel levy has remained static for about 7 years, inflation has continued to chip away the purchasing power of the amount collected. It is notable that in 2016, the price of litre for petrol was Kenya shillings 95, while the levy was 18. 7 years later, Mr. Speaker, the price of this petrol is 218, while the fuel levy is still 18 shillings. While the fuel levy collection trend has flattened, the length of the roads, primarily rural roads, which have been upgraded to bitumen standards over the last 10 years, has increased by 4,000 kilometers. These newly upgraded roads need to be maintained. There is a comprehensive and modern approach to road maintenance known as performance-based maintenance. Under this approach, a service provider is engaged competitively to provide maintenance, which is measured in terms of specified output indicators, such as whether surface damage has been repaired promptly, drains are cleared, and the vegetation is always trimmed below a given height. The performance-based approach gives strong incentives to serve providers to do quality work at all times, since it is the most efficient way to avoid repeat jobs and associated costs. In the ideal scenario, a road should be placed under active performance-based maintenance immediately it's constructed and throughout the lifetime until new major upgrade. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the National Highway Authority, whose heavily trafficked roads are well placed to benefit from performance-based maintenance, is currently not able to roll out this approach due to insufficient funds despite getting 40% of the fuel levy. The backlog of the road maintenance for the national highways is actually increasing, meaning that we may start to see potholes on major arteries due to delayed interventions. The Urban Roads Authority is not faring any better. Whereas the mandate of KURA is to maintain roads classified as urban national roads, in practice, KURA has had to intervene massively in cities, major towns, and county headquarters across the country. KURA is suffering from lack of resources to discharge this mandate. However, the most alarming situation, Mr. Speaker, is rural roads. The Rural Roads Authority does not have a robust mechanism to secure funds for any kind of regular maintenance of paved rural roads, let alone performance-based maintenance. The sad truth is that the paved roads under KERA are orphans in financial sense. As a matter of fact, members of Parliament, through the Constituent Roads Committee, are opposed to any attempt, Mr. Speaker, to allocate any money under 22% or 10% on maintenance of tarmac roads, Mr. Speaker. It is therefore true to say, Mr. Speaker, we are waiting a catastrophe. No wonder many Kenyans are complaining of potholes in many rural roads across the country, especially the low-volume seal roads. Mr. Speaker, the implications of the non-availability of funds for maintenance of the rural roads are clear. If a solution is not found for rural roads, the recently paved rural roads will be deteriorate rapidly, and both the minister and indeed the distinguished members will face difficult questions for which we will not have immediate answers from the public. A significant portion of rural roads which are upgraded to be paved roads standard were constructed in expectation that traffic volumes were minimal and relatively low expectation would suffice. In practice, economic activities are promptly picked up as new roads were opened to traffic for specific loading. Overloading has caused distress on several pavements. This makes effective maintenance even more urgent and necessary. It is in this context, Mr. Speaker, that the portion of the report of the National Dialogue Committee, which mentions a reduction of Kenya shillings 5 per litre in fuel levy, should give us a pause of reflection concerning the consequence of the road sector. Going forward, we anticipate the government will be reverting to this distinguished house for assistance and support in relation to securing adequate funds for maintenance of the various classes of national roads. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, in another 3 minutes, with your permission, Mr. Speaker, we have challenges with the development vote. This is only 3 minutes and I'll conclude. Then I will get the necessary guidance from this house.
You'll have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having outlined the basic principle of fund allocation under the development vote, allow me to go to specific details in regard to the challenges of road financing, which have a bearing on the project implementation and equitable allocation of funds. In summary, Mr. Speaker, it is not true that the Minister of Roads and its agencies are in any way marginalizing any part of our country. Instead, the ministry works hand in hand with this august house to ensure resources are distributed fairly across the country. Mr. Speaker, the State Department of Roads has a significant budget deficit, leading to inadequate allocation of road projects. The implementation of the Road 10,000 program from the year 2013-2014, which took place in the absence of anticipated progressive rise in budget ceilings by the National Treasury, led to a portfolio of projects not being adequately funded. The rollout of Road 10,000 program ended a full circle in 2017-2018, when net government GOK budget stress started being witnessed. In the first and second years of the Road 10,000 program, an average allocation was given to be 20 billion provided. It was expected that this allocation would progress upwards. However, over time, ceiling allocation for roads in state started diminishing into an average of 55 billion from the year 2017-2018. In the 2021-2022 financial year, the State Department of Roads had allocation of 55 billion for contracts against, Mr. Speaker, an outstanding project portfolio of 900 billion shillings as of July 1st, 2022. In order to address the issue of outstanding portfolio vis-a-vis the resource available, the State Department embarked on reduction of portfolio, which currently stands at 700 billion. The reduction entailed dropping some planned but not yet awarded projects. With an average of 55 billion GOK component for contracted works and land compensation, the outstanding portfolio will take a minimum of 15 years to complete, assuming all factors remain constant, including inflation, claims, and interest. The limited allocation vis-a-vis the outstanding project portfolio result in thinly spread allocation for projects. Most of the projects that current government is implementing were awarded prior to 2020-2021 financial year. In order to address the issue of marginalized counties in terms of roadworks, the State Department would have to increase the portfolio of projects to address the disparity. This would, however, mean even thinner spread of allocation and more years to complete any of these projects. Mr. Speaker, the thin spread of GOK funding available means the road projects take longer to complete, become more expensive due to passage of time, and attract interest and more claims. Mr. Speaker, and this is my last and important point, in the current financial year, the government of Kenya allocation from this house for Department of Roads is 76 billion, against the request by National Treasury of 250 billion. The State Department therefore started the financial year with a budget shortfall of 70%. During the first supplementary budget, the 76 billion was reduced to 61 billion, Mr. Speaker. Out of the allocated 61 billion, the amount for the development of the roads is 46 billion, has been allocated for development. This inadequate budget provision vis-a-vis the youth portfolio of road projects has led to stalling of road projects everywhere in the country. And Mr. Speaker, I need to insist, everywhere in the country, because in one part of the country, they think another part is being considered. And if you go to that part, they think another part has been considered. Mr. Speaker, out of the outstanding GOK portfolio, there is a component of 155 billion pending bills as at 30th of October 2023. The available money to service those pending bills is 46 billion, which is less than 1/3 of the provision required to pay outstanding bills on road projects, in addition to more work that will be certified within the remaining portion of financial year. In association with the large stock of pending bills...
Time up, Minister.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, if I don't make this last point, it will not complete on the development.
How many minutes?
Give me 3. Then
minutes.
I'll finish. I actually have 2 pages, so it may be less than 3. In association with the large stock of pending bills in the requirement to pay interest of the same and resource by contractors to claims to recover the cost, in this regard, the ministry is considering to propose a new legislation to be brought to this house to cap the potential liabilities from inadequate funded projects in the manner similar to Induplam rule, Mr. Speaker. Because we have now a situation where a road is awarded 1 billion, but the claims are about 3 or 4 billion in the same road because it's been abandoned, and their claims and their interest, Mr. Speaker. Delayed release of budget of GOK exchequer also impacts the development of roads. It is expected that once the budget has been approved, the exchequer would optimally be released in tranches as the year progresses. In the current financial year, Mr. Speaker, against the budget of 76 billion under printed estimates, Mr. Speaker, the only releases we have received up to now is 6 billion shillings to serve, Mr. Speaker, pending roads of 155 billion and a budget of 76 billion. Even when you sit in that office and contractors are coming asking for support, Mr. Speaker, you wonder, if you spread 6 billion against a claim of 155 billion, which contractor would you give money to go on site, on which one would you not? If you give a contractor who is claiming 2-3 billion, you give them 100 million, they are unable to mobilize to go on site. And that is the true situation as we have in our country. Mr. Speaker, as I conclude, I have already touched on the matter of public participation projects while answering the questions above. But Mr. Speaker, these public participation and other projects that are introduced to satisfy constitutional requirements could be perceived to contribute to skewed net of allocation unless, Mr. Speaker, and it will cause the situation that we have now. If you see members are angry here because they come to my office the way they come to your office, Mr. Speaker, a lot of the questions is the public participation funded roads allocated by this house every year. And Mr. Speaker, unless there is a proper sensitization and, Mr. Speaker, a full discussion by this chamber in a honest manner about the appropriation of these public participation funds, Mr. Speaker, this feeling of marginalization will continue. Most of these maintenance roads under public participation initiative are implemented by KERA. It is notable that all roads under the development budget are itemized and approved by this house. Once Parliament has appropriated and approved the specific project to be implemented, the road agencies will implement. Mr. Speaker, I have a suggestion that, Mr. Speaker, instead of this house, and I can only suggest, because this house is supreme to all of us, Instead of this House allocating the 21 billion to either new projects or projects that are below 10 million or maintenance of roads, Mr. Speaker, if this 21 billion was available to support the pending bills, Mr. Speaker, most of our contractors would have come back to site to make sure that those roads are progressing. But this is a suggestion. I have no control as to this House, what this House decides, Mr. Speaker. I am just suggesting to the House that if you can consider, Mr. Speaker, supporting the pending bills, it will be great. While the ministry is committed to equity, it is worth noting that some of the factors considered discussion about inequity, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, I conclude by saying this. Not all is gloom, Mr. Speaker. The government has been working extremely hard for the last 1 year to speak to our development partners, both bilateral and multilateral. I speak with experience, Mr. Speaker, because you know, and I have appraised you on this issue. I have had to travel to many different parts of this world, Mr. Speaker, and particularly to one of our bilateral partners' countries to try to request them to consider supporting us. Mr. Speaker, the conversations are in advanced stage. Mr. Speaker, I believe that in another 2 or so months, I should be able to come back to this chamber, if invited again, to give the good news to honorable members that some of our critical number of our roads will resume, Mr. Speaker, thanks to the efforts we are working to make sure that those development partners support us. And Mr. Speaker, with utmost respect, I want to thank those development partners for listening to the Republic of Kenya and for listening to Excellency the President, having been a member of his delegation to many of these countries to deal with this issue. The last issue, Mr. Speaker, is to thank the development partners for helping us deal with the question of Eurobond, because this is where the devil lies. It is the Eurobond payment, Mr. Speaker, that is due of $2 billion that has made it impossible for us to either borrow for infrastructure or, Mr. Speaker, to be able to get other resources allocated, and even for our budget to be constricted, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I sit down, many members here may feel that I am a bit hard when it comes to the question of these public resources. Mr. Speaker, I have been a victim, Mr. Speaker, of Mr. Speaker, berating, harassment on something, Mr. Speaker, I have zero control. If I had a chance to sit where my colleagues sit, and we have sat with them in this House, Mr. Speaker, I would use this floor to, Mr. Speaker, correct the injustice and the marginalization. Because if you take this punishment to an innocent cabinet secretary who has zero role in allocating of money or budget, Mr. Speaker, it would be unfair in the Republic of Kenya. And I say this, Mr. Speaker, with all my heart. I am the only cabinet secretary, I don't want to praise myself, who has invited as many counties, I'm now in county number 26, to come for an open discussion without considering a political side, to ask ourselves, how shall we deliver on this very difficult road function in the absence of the budget that we have been given? So, Mr. Speaker, even when we feel the pain, and I have spoken to my friends here, when we feel the pain, and the pain of our voters saying we are stuck in mud, the roads are not progressing, this pain is a collective responsibility of leadership at such a time as this. And I promise this House, I will not sleep until we succeed to return all the contractors to go on site, and there is a light at the end of the tunnel. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order, honorable members. This was Robert Mboi's question. The minister, hold on. The CS is no longer on the floor, so there's nothing out of order. The question belongs to Robert Mbui, but the minister has wandered far and wide on the issue. I'll give the first shot to the questioner, Robert Mbui. Then I'll give Minister, you note the questions. I'll give 5. You answer. Those will be joyriders. After the first 5, I'll give an